use the gavel. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. If I could have your attention, please. Thank you.
I don't know who gave you that.
Thank you. This meeting won't be nearly as exciting as the one yesterday, I don't think, right? But thank you, everyone, for being here this morning. We have PFM here today, who is going to give us an update, as they did a few weeks ago, on the financial condition of the county. They're going to update us on their financial trend analysis and also their workforce management audit, along with some preliminary recommendations. So I'd like to introduce Gordon Mann. And Gordon, if you want to introduce your team, and then take it away.
This right? Yes. Got it. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having us back. For those of you who I know I see a lot of familiar faces at this point, people we've met throughout the process. For those who do not remember me, or we perhaps met another member of our team, my name is Gordon Mann. I'm from a company called Public Financial Management. The county brought us in April to conduct a financial and operational review of the county, what has been termed kind of an MRI of finances and of operations. I brought friends this time. I'm joined by my colleagues Lauren Sokovich and Rose Tesler, both of whom you will hear from here shortly in regards to the financial presentation. Let me see if I've completely mastered the technology. Yes, I have. All right. So the last time we were here to talk about cash. We were here to talk about the county's ability to pay its bills in full and on time throughout the year. We talked about the cash shortfall. We talked about some options for dealing with that shortfall. And we talked about the fact that there were three types of financial stability. Cash, can you pay your bills today? That's what we talked about last time. I'm not going to touch on that as much. The short update is things look largely the same now as they did a month ago, so that picture has not changed substantially. The third element of it is structural stability. Can you pay your bills not just today, but over a period of years? And the middle part of that is what you will hear about in about, let's see, today's the third, in about 12 days, which is the budgetary stability. So what we are presenting today is not the budget. You'll see very shortly that it couldn't be because it's vastly out of balance. But we are presenting it now because it provides context for understanding what the commissioners and what the department directors and what all of you are thinking about as part of the budget process. So what we're going to talk about today is structural stability. But in the back of your mind, if it's not already there, I just put it there, is talking about the 2025 budget, which again will be presented in a couple of weeks. Uh-oh. I broke it, Felicia.
Okay. As Gordon mentioned, we're going to focus today on structural stability, which is really the county's recurring revenues balanced against its recurring expenditures over a period of time. The main analytical tool that we use for this analysis is a baseline financial projection. We developed this looking at primarily the county's general fund over the next 5 years, so starting with the 2024 budget and projecting out to 2029. There's a couple of contextual points that we wanted to just cover up front about the analytical tool and the baseline projection, just to highlight our methodology. The first is that the baseline projection presents a status quo scenario. So what that means really is that we do not anticipate in our projection tax increases, headcount changes, changes to services, or any other changes that we don't know about today. And we'll dig into our specific assumptions and where that may differ. The second, which Gordon also touched on, is that this is not a predictive scenario. We're not trying to say this is what the county's finances will look like, because as you'll see in a couple of slides, we're projecting deficits, large deficits starting in 2025. So the county will necessarily have to take corrective action over the next couple of weeks as it's going through its budget process. So again, this will not reflect what is going to be in the 2025 budget. It's a tool to analyze the county's finances and understand what is driving the structural deficits. Looking back on the last 5 years, the county has had a structural imbalance for some time. We've looked at the county's finances starting in 2019 all the way through 2023 preliminary actuals. On this slide, we also reference the September 2023 ratings report from S&P, where they cited that the county had structural imbalance, weak budgetary performance, and continued to rely on one-time measures to balance its budget. And this is consistent with the findings in our analysis. Over the past 5 years, the county has had deficits ranging from $500,000 to over $6 million. And it's used its cash reserves to cover those deficits. So if you look at this slide, the blue bar is the county's cash levels from its audits, and you can see that it's declined over the past 5 years. So taken together, the county has a structural imbalance that's developed over a multi-year period. Looking forward, this is the baseline projection that we've developed for the county. Again, starting in 2024, the county's budget in the general fund had a $500,000 deficit. And as you can see in 2025, we're projecting that to grow to $27.2 million. And we'll talk about the kind of one-time changes that are impacting that one-time growth in the deficit. And then looking beyond that, this is when we get into talking about the structural balance and the structural deficit. The deficit grows incrementally from 2026 through 2029, really reflecting that the county's revenues in a baseline scenario are stagnant while its expenditures continue to grow with inflation and wage increases and other external factors that drive expenditure growth.
So I just want to hit one thing here. There's two different kinds of deficits that we're talking about, because if you just heard that the county's deficit goes from $500,000 to $27.2 million, and you're going, holy cow, what happened? That is a huge jump. Let me pause to explain partially what that is. I'm going to back away from the microphone just for a second. This is your operating deficit, right? This is the deficit between revenues and expenses this year. Everything you bring in within your budget, everything you bring in terms of revenues, everything that comes out in terms of expenditures adds up to a deficit of $500,000. If you pull out the 2024 budget, that's what it will show you for the general fund. But that $500,000 deficit is only $500,000 because there's about $10 million worth of one-time things that the county's doing to get through this year. Use of federal stimulus money, debt refinancing, a refund from its health insurance. These are the things that we talked about the last time we were here. If it weren't for those things, the deficit this year would have been closer to $10 or $11 million, right? So structural deficit is saying, I can't sell my car to pay for groceries every month. I got one shot at doing that. Once that's gone, what does the structural deficit look like? So this goes from operating deficit in the $500,000 to structural deficit. And we are going to primarily focus on the structural deficit because the goal here is not just to get you through another 12 months. The goal is to get you to a point where your revenues and expenses are balanced on a recurring basis.
So digging in just to the revenue side a little bit, this is what the county's revenues have looked like over the past 5 years and then looking ahead for another 5 years. The largest source of revenue for the county is tax revenue, and that's primarily the real estate tax. So most of that kind of gray bar at the bottom is your real estate tax. The county also has around 20% of its general fund budget come from external reimbursements, mostly associated with the corrections and human services functions. From 2019 to 2023, the county's total revenue grew at around 2.7%, and that was primarily driven by a tax increase that happened in 2020. Beyond that, the revenues are generally flat, and that's what you see in the baseline projection from 2025 through 2029. We forecast around a 1% growth rate, all things consistent. So all things considering like taxes and reimbursement rates and things like that, we do not anticipate any increases there. So what trends drive this revenue picture? Gordon touched on one of these a second ago. You can go to the next slide.
Yeah, just to hit one thing there, remember, this is a carry forward baseline scenario where we assume no changes. So Lauren just said we assume no tax increases. Spoiler alert, there will be a tax increase next year. How do I know that? Because you're going to have to do the unfunded debt borrowing to get through this year, and the only way you're going to pay for that is a tax increase. So please do not come away from that last slide going, oh, PFM just said they don't have to increase taxes. No, what PFM said was this is a baseline scenario that shows you what happens if you take no corrective actions, including with your tax rate.
The first trend I'll just touch on again. Gordon mentioned this. The reason that we see that, one of the reasons that we see a big jump in 2025 in the deficit is the loss of those short-term deficit closing options. In 2024, the county used nearly $11 million to balance its budget from sources that we don't anticipate will recur in the baseline scenario. So that's money from debt refinancing, from ARPA, and a little bit from a reimbursement that the county received from its healthcare provider. The county might use some amount of ARPA to close its 2025 budget, but we don't assume this in the baseline, and we don't assume any additional one-time sources. So that's why you see on this slide, the county's revenue actually drops from $165 million to $150 million next year. The second trend is that the county's largest revenue source, its real estate tax, does not tend to grow unless the county increases the tax rate. The real estate tax is a function of three main things. One is the taxable assessed value, so it's the assessed value of all properties within the county, the tax rate, and the collection rate, which is the percentage of taxes that are owed and paid within that year. Current year revenues, if you look at the table, typically grow between 0.5 and 0.6% outside of years where the county did a tax increase. In recent years, the county did relatively small tax increases, one in 2020 and another in 2024. The county has not done a major tax increase since 2012 when it increased the millage rate by around 40%. So what do we assume in the baseline? Again, this is the baseline status quo scenario, so we would not assume in this scenario any tax increases. So we show that revenues associated with real estate tax will grow at 0.6%, reflecting the taxable assessed value growth. The county is currently undergoing a reassessment for the first time since 1968 to obtain a more current and accurate assessment of the properties within the county. The calculations are still ongoing, and we're anticipating that will take effect in January of 2026. So how are we accounting for this in our baseline projection? The first thing that we assume is that the property values will go up just because it's been many decades since the county has reevaluated its properties. The second is that property taxes will go down because it's anticipated to be a revenue neutral action, even though individual tax bills may increase or decrease through this process. So how do we account for the reassessment? On a revenue side, we assume that it will be revenue neutral, and we don't add any additional revenue associated with the reassessment.
In addition to the reassessment that Lauren just talked about, is my mic on? Can you hear? Okay. There are a few other risks to the county's largest revenue source that we wanted to highlight in this presentation. The first one is the sale of the Commonwealth Health System to a nonprofit operator called Woodbridge. Because Woodbridge is a nonprofit, they will not pay county real estate tax on those hospital and other healthcare facilities that they are acquiring. In total, this means about $12 million in taxable assessed value comes out of the total for the county, which we do show in our projection. And at current tax rates, this results in about an $800,000 loss in revenue for the county. Gordon, can we actually go back to show that in the table? So you see that taxable assessed value, which is the first row, actually goes down from 2024 to 2025. So we've built in the sale into our projection. We can go back to the factors. The next factor we want to highlight is a lower collection rate. The county in its 2024 budget used a 91.1% collection rate on real estate taxes, but for our projections, we've actually lowered this to an 89.9% collection rate. We used 89.9% because it's the historical average between 2019 and 2023, and it also builds in some contingency that the 91.1 doesn't have. The other factor affecting these collection rates are the assessment appeals, which were highlighted to us by the single tax office, that there's been an increase in the number of assessment appeals, and also that these appeals can be granted either as a reimbursement on taxes paid or as a credit, which makes it very difficult to anticipate the total effect of those assessment appeals because you don't know the total number and you don't know whether there'll be credits or reimbursements. But altogether, between the lower collection rate and the sale of the system, we show a almost $2 million decline in the real estate tax revenue in 2025 compared to the 2024 budget. Even though the real estate tax is the county's largest source of revenue and makes up the majority of its revenue, the county also receives a significant portion of its budget from non-tax revenues in the form of reimbursements and grants from the federal and state governments. Unlike real estate taxes, the county really doesn't have direct control and can't use these sources to generate revenue because they're for specific purposes. So you can't use any excess reimbursement for children and youth to cover any shortfall or unanticipated expenses in your prison. Looking at the county's expenditure side, the county's largest expenditure category is personnel expenses. Personnel expenses are made up mainly of cash compensation, comprising most of it, but also the benefits for employees, which include health insurance and pension benefits. The next largest category that you'll see is the operating expenses. The most of the operating expenses come from contracted services and professional services, but this category also includes spending on materials, equipment, vehicles, and also utilities and rent for county facilities. In the historical period, we saw the total expenditures within the general fund grow at an annualized rate of about 2.5% each year. The expenditures in our forecast are expected to grow at about 2.7% each year, and this growth is driven by increases in wages, raises, and inflation on all those materials and contracts and other personnel expenses. We do want to note that our current cash flow projection anticipates the county will spend 1.7% less in 2024 than it put in its 2024 budget. We're going to talk about later in this section how we have incorporated some of those savings into our projection.
Yeah, and just to highlight, to remember what we talked about the last time we were here, Lackawanna County essentially has 13 months of expenses in a 12-month period. The last month of 2023, where the bills were not able to be paid, carried over somewhere in the realm of $11 to $15 million, and then the 12 months that you budgeted for this year. So the problem, as we see it in the numbers, is not that the county went hog wild and spent a bunch of stuff in 2024, but rather that 13 and 12 are not the same number. If you carry one extra month of expenses into the year and you have one flat revenue, you don't make that up. So that is in essence the cash. That continues to be the story of the cash flow shortfall, even though the county's spending in terms of contracts has slowed down. The spending, when we look at what is the county authorizing, what are they spending, what are the dollars that are going out on a month-to-month basis, it seems to be slowing down. It will slow down even more because of the hiring freeze and because of the freeze on discretionary spending. But you can't freezing spending and cutting it by a month are not the same thing.
And diving into that very large chunk of expenditures that is on personnel, we found that almost 2/3 of general fund employees are represented by one of the 7 bargaining units in the county. Although most of the contracts for these bargaining units extend through 25, 26, or 27, the SEIU contract, which is the second largest within the general fund, does expire this year, and the county is currently in negotiations with SEIU. The county does have more direct control over those for 2025, as well as the spending on the 1/3 of employees who are not in a bargaining unit. Again, looking deeper at that personnel spending, in the past 5 years, we saw that salary and wage spending in the general fund grew about 2.9% each year. As I touched on at the start of this expenditure category, there were some areas where the county this year is spending less than its budget. A key area where the county is spending less is the salary and wage spending. To kind of account for that and to carry that forward, we built in a vacancy assumption to our salary and wage projections, and that carries forward any savings that the county has generated from positions that aren't filled or where there's been turnover.
So this is the point in the presentation where things start to get a little bit uncomfortable. We've been talking high level about revenues. Now we're going to talk about expenses, and we're going to talk about people, which means we're going to talk about pretty much everybody who's in this room, right? Most of county government's expenditures are on personnel. Most personnel, probably, except for the majority of the people who are in this room, have their compensation, by which we're going to talk about three main pieces here. Cash compensation, which is mostly salaries, although some folks get some other types of cash compensation, health insurance, and pensions. We're going to hit all three of them here. The story, for the most part, for governments in this part of the country, this isn't specific to Lackawanna or even Pennsylvania, is most of your compensation costs are set by union contracts, right? Most employees are in a bargaining unit, everything but the top line there. And the county does not have the ability unilaterally to say, well, we're just going to freeze wages next year, or well, we're just going to get rid of that health and plan, or we're just going to cut the pension benefits. Can't do that. You have to collectively bargain with unions, and you have to reach a point of agreement to be able to make any kind of meaningful, large change in compensation. But this actually happens to be a moment when the county has a rare opportunity to make a change in the next 3 months that sets the pattern and sets the course for the next 4 or 5 years. The reason for that is you have two groups who either are coming out of a contract or don't have one, right? So the first group is the non-bargaining unit. Again, that's probably most of you in the room, but that's also anybody who is not in a union, and that is your largest group of employees. It's almost 36% in the general fund. If you zoom out to all funds and you grab the ones that the Area Agency on Aging and Domestic Relations and all those other smaller funds, it actually gets larger. Now you're up to about 45% of the workforce. The second group is the SEIU union. This is your broadest union. This is everything from maintenance workers to clerical staff. It covers a wide range of employees, and it's got 164 employees, and their contract ends this year, as in within 90 days, right? So negotiations are happening right now with that union that will set the compensation levels for that bargaining unit. That union goes in front of all the others, right? Prison is the largest union. Its contract expires in 27. Probation and domestic relations is about 60 employees. That's 25, and everybody else is 2026. What the county does in the next 90 days with its own employees, or with its non-union employees, they're all county employees, and then the SEIU union will set the pattern for everybody else. So this is not a case where we come here and we say, gee, bad news, all your costs are personnel, they're all in unions, and you can't touch them until 2026, right? You can make a difference right now in what will happen in the 2025 budget and through the SEIU negotiations. So if anyone is curious and they keep mentioning a structural deficit, you could print out this slide. It's this slide in essence. The wage increases that you have here are our projections, right? So they're not recommendations. We're not recommending that these be the wage increases, but these historically have been the wage increases for employees. If you back this chart up and you went backwards instead of going forwards from 25 to 29, you went backwards, you would see the percentages are all largely the same anyway. So what we're doing is we're basically, again, assuming carrying forward what historical wage increases have been. And I would say the other thing about these wage increases, they're not outlandish, right? When we will talk about compensation, and in our report, we'll look more at compensation in a more specific way. But when we look at the average annual salary across county government, which I recognize is a very wide swath of people, and we look at the average annual salary across Lackawanna County, which is an even wider swath of people, they're pretty even, right? So this is not a case where county government employees, union or not, are getting fabulously wealthy. But what happens is really the key line on this slide becomes this one. That's your revenue to pay for anything, right? That's your real estate tax. And again, what it does is not much. Unless you adjust the millage, even reassessment won't change this. unless you adjust the millage, the growth is fairly flat. So if I just focus on this line, 0.2% over 5 years, what wage increase can I afford to give anybody? Well, the answer is zero, right? Because my revenues don't grow. You don't want to be in that situation, and you haven't been. There haven't been 5 years of zeros going backwards. You have to, and you want to give people fair, affordable wage increases. But the structure you have, where you start from, is with one horse that doesn't go anywhere. Right? The second part of this, for context, that we look at is what do we think inflation will be? And you can put as much weight on this as you want. It's a federal bank survey. They generate it once every quarter. It's a survey of forecasters, so it's a survey of surveys. And right now they project that inflation will be about 2.5% per year. It goes up, it goes down. It could be very different within this market. It could be very different for individual households. But if you're trying to say, look, I don't want my employees to fall farther behind. I want them to at least be able to stay up in terms of the cost of living, the cost of bread, the cost of gas, the cost of health insurance. You would have to do about 2.5% per year. At least that's what the forecast is right now. But again, what you have to pay for it is a flat line. This is why going several years without a real estate tax becomes really, really hard. Is every year your revenue is essentially the same and your expenses grow. And while I'm focused on salaries here, I could wipe this out and do this with health insurance. I could do it with the cost of gas. I could do it with the cost of the chairs you're sitting in. The cost of anything goes up over time. And if revenues don't, then that means you fall farther and farther behind. Now, you could take this concept too far. You could say, well, I guess what he's saying is we just got to increase taxes all the time and that's it, right? And that is not the takeaway. Because there are variables you can control, right? In terms of expenditures, and this is spending to budget. So overall, the county this year has spent less than budgeted on salaries. That's overall. But there's 42 or so different departments. And if you zoom on individual departments, the story changes. So I don't know if anybody can read these numbers, but the concept here is red number bad, good, green number good, at least from a financial perspective, right? Anytime you see a red number, that means a department has spent more than budgeted on salaries for that individual year. Anytime you see a green number, it means the department has spent less than budget. And there are only 4 departments up here. So we picked 4 that have the most extreme versions of this trend so that we could make the point. If the numbers were smaller, the point would be harder to see. But OIFAS, that's your youth and family services, where you're all familiar with the difficulty in filling those positions. No surprise, the result of that is you spend less than budgeted. Now, that might make people like me happy, but there's another world to this. You have to hire those people. They have to deliver the services. You can't fall too far behind. You have to fill those spots. So good from green is good from a financial perspective, but I want to just acknowledge very clearly that there's another perspective in here. The red numbers for the sheriff's office, it's 3 out of 5 years. For court administration, it's 5 out of 5 years. For the prison, it's 5 out of 5 years. But size matters. Sheriffs, if we go to the far right, it's a difference. It's 3.9%. It's a difference of $150,000. Court administration, which is just one part of the courts, it's a bigger percentage. It's 6.3, but on a dollar basis, it's about the same. The prison, it's about the same as the court, but because the prison's big, 7% is almost $1 million, and then it swings the other way for OIFAS. There are 2 general things that can be driving this. One is you're spending more than budget. We're going to talk about position control in a second. Positions that are not authorized or don't actually exist or aren't funded get filled. Wage increases that weren't funded occur. Things of that nature happen, right? So that's the first side of it. The second side of it is the budget could be wrong. If you under budget for what the salaries are, then naturally a department is going to spend more than that. Not because they're doing something wrong or because they're not managing their budget, but maybe the budget needs to be addressed. So that's the takeaway, is it could be either one in these story. The way to read this is not, well, the prison's blowing their budget. Look at that every single year. Maybe that is part of it, but the budget has to be accurate so you have a good starting point to work from. So the first thing is your spending versus your budget. That is a controllable variable. The second thing is the position mix, right? So I pulled the sheriff's department here. This is the different types of wages that are paid to all staff, not just the deputies, but primarily the deputies in the sheriff's department. The county breaks it out so by employee type, so you get elected officials, part-time, and salary staff. It also breaks it out by type. If I am sick and I miss tomorrow's portion of my paycheck gets booked as sick time. It's not additional pay, it's just a portion of my regular salary. It's an accounting thing, but you can focus on this line here, and you can see that the salary growth is about 5.3% per year. And it's not an even 5.3%. Flat during the pandemic, that pattern is very similar just about everywhere, bounces back to 5.4%, or it goes from 3.2 before COVID to 3.4 in 2021. Again, that pattern is very common. But now in the last 2 years, it increases by from 3.4 to 3.7. That's a 7%, 7.5% increase. And then 3.7 to almost 4. That's an 8% increase. Again, some of this is just the wage increase. Right? Your collective bargaining increases are 3.5 to 3% a year. But 7 is not 3. So some of this is something else. And it looks like in the case of the sheriff's department, what's happening is you have a shift from about 35 part-time deputy sheriffs who are cheaper. And if we did this for health insurance, this would look the same. Part-time deputies don't get the health insurance. So you start with a mix of 12 corporals. Those are the very senior deputies, 33 full-time and 35 part-time. And by the end of the period, you have 3 more corporals, you have 14 more full-time, and you have a whole bunch less part-time. So what you have in this department, and there may be very good operational reasons for this, but what the math is showing us is it's not just wage increases, it's not just cost of living adjustments, it's something else. There are decisions here that are controllable, that are within the power of the people in this room and the unions who have to participate in a large part of this to say, hey, we have to do something different. The last part of this, which gets even more into the weeds, and again, I'll use the sheriff's office here as the example, although I could have done this with the prison, frankly, just as easily, is we've talked about what your wages are, we've talked about what your mix of positions are, now we're going to get super nerdy and we're going to talk about what your work rules are. This is the old how many plumbers does it take to change a light bulb joke or whatever it is with the union rules. So in terms of union rules, in terms of the sheriff's deputy, the contract, which again, the sheriff or the folks up here, you have to negotiate that in order to get a different result. The sheriff's office, the sheriff's contract has a number of different provisions in it, either as they're being read and interpreted or as they actually exist. So one is you have 16 posts on the weekend that get filled. Sheriff's deputies, primary function is security, got to have it, not a discretionary service, right? You have buildings that need to have security on the weekend, again, got to have it, not a discretionary service. But what is happening is most of those shifts on the weekend are filled by full-time deputies on overtime, right? About 90% of them are full-time deputies on overtime, and about 10% are part-time. That's really expensive. Now, there might be reasons to do that operationally, but it's not just full-time versus part-time. It's full-time at the overtime rate, which is 1.5 times regular salary, versus part-time. Could you do that differently? Could you use part-timers there more? Could you have those be regularly scheduled shifts? You'd have to make sure you have enough people to actually staff that. But what could you do in terms of scheduling so that you're not paying 1.5 times the hourly rate at every building in the county every single weekend? What about having full-time? What about a shift opens up, somebody gets sick, and I have to offer it to somebody because, again, I got to fill that slot downstairs or at the court building. It's not a discretionary service. Who do I bring in to fill it? Right now, the way the contract is interpreted is you have to offer the slot to every full-time deputy on overtime first. And if they all say, nah, I'm good, then you could go to the part-time. But the part-time is not somewhere where you can plug that in under the union contract and get that lower spending directly, at least not as the contract is written and not as the contract is being read. This is where compensation is about way more than what's the across-the-board salary increase.
Can I ask a question really quick?
Yes.
So have you ever seen a situation, like, to me, the reason that you have part-time deputies or part-time any position is to avoid overtime or to save on overtime. So it seems to be like completely, the scheduling to me seems to be completely out of whack. Is that?
It is it's out of whack, and it's not uncommon. So even if you take this in the realm of firefighters, right, part-time firefighters and full-time firefighters, the other side of this that I'm not saying is what the union perspective would be is the full-time deputies, they're more senior, they have more training, it's a safety issue, and I can't make that argument as eloquently as they can because I'm not the union head. But that kind of tension where they say, we want you to be able to, it's okay for you to use part-time employees, but we're not going to let you use part-time employees to shrink our staff. That would be the union perspective. So not uncommon, but having this go this far where every weekend staff or almost every weekend post is scheduled overtime. And again, I'm just assuming that this is the way the contract is actually written, that this is the case, that every open slot has to be offered to every full-time deputy. That's going way far the other direction. So the end result of this is you have salaries that go up. And again, I promise you, I'm not trying to pick exclusively on the sheriff's department because I could do this for the prison too. The story would be slightly different. The numbers might actually even be larger. And it is primarily those two departments for overtime because most of the overtime is in those departments for obvious operational reasons. But you have salaries grow by 5.3%. You have holiday pay grow by 7.5%. The county did add a holiday and changed which one of them are considered quote unquote major holidays, where you get paid an extra amount for working on Christmas. Working on Christmas gets you more money than working on Memorial Day in essence. And overtime grows. So normally what you're looking for is as salary spending goes up because I have more positions, overtime goes down because I need it less, or if I can't fill those positions, as salary spending goes down because I have vacancies, overtime spending goes up, and you would like to see it kind of level out to a 2 to 3% level. But instead what you have here is everything's growing. And again, even if we set philosophy aside or whether that makes sense to you or any of the other stuff, what is the revenue that I have to pay for it? Real estate taxes. And what does that do? Nothing. I think this is still me, right? Health insurance, right? So those are the variables that you can control in the salary world. You can control through the salaries through negotiations, and you can control the mix of positions, budget to make sure the budget is accurate and budget to actual spending, and work rules, again, largely through negotiations. The other big part of the county's spending is health insurance, right? It's a regular part of compensation. It's an important part of compensation. You want your employees to be healthy. You want to provide good coverage. Offering health insurance is a given. Health insurance expenses have grown faster than salaries, a little more unevenly because it's not based on, I give you 3% per year, but it's based on the experience of employees. So if you have a year where a bunch of people get very seriously ill, that becomes more expensive and it washes through. There is obviously much less control you have over employee health, and you need employees to get the care they need, whether you're thinking about it utilitarian perspective to get them back to work or just from a human perspective. But what's happening is the health insurance costs are going at about 6.5% is what we assume here. And that is a steeper line. If you just remember what the salary line did and what the health insurance line did, the growth here is more significant. So 4 different types of health insurance plans in the county, right? Think of the different types of offerings. Basically, the difference between a health insurance plan is which providers can I go to and under which circumstances and how much will get paid. Most expensive plan, what's called the Aetna EPO plan here. This plan allows you basically to go anywhere, right? For those who have access to it, there is no defined provider network. You can go anywhere, provided you can get the insurance company to pay for it. But that network is there and exists. That's a very expensive plan. The PPO is, even though it's in the middle here, it's actually the cheaper of the 3 plans. The HMO, these two, there's the HMO at the other end of things. You could only go to the doctors within the defined network if you want the county's health insurance to cover it, right? In network and out of network. And then the PPO is designed to take the place of the purple. The green's designed to take the place of the purple because it has a similar concept but a lower cost. But you have 4 different health plans here in Lackawanna County, and you can see which one is the most popular plans. That's the HMOs. Which one is the most expensive? Purple one by far. You'll see a second, the blue and the green aren't cheap either, but the purple one by far. And this is another place where you have a chance to make a difference right now, because most of the people on that purple plan are either non-union represented or an SEIU. So this is your window to change the cost for that group. Why would you want to change it? Because you're spending way more on health insurance than other places, right? So your plans here are very generous in terms of coverage, and there might be good reasons for that. I'm sure there's a story behind it, and I'm sure the union negotiations would tell me what that story is. But if you just look at the bottom here, the bottom is all health insurance plans nationally, and this is spending per employee on a monthly basis. All employers nationally, it's about $600 for single coverage and about $1,500 for family coverage, right? Your cheapest plan here, the Highmark PPO, which only 39 people have, is $640 for single coverage and $2,000 for family. Now, if I say, okay, let's back away from all the plans. Let's compare apples to apples. Let's compare the HMOs that people have nationally to the HMOs you have here. HMOs here, $720 for single coverage versus $565 for single coverage. HMOs here, about $2,500 for family coverage, nationally $1,500 for family coverage. So again, that is a real gap that the county needs to take action to close. And we'll finish with some ideas on how to do so.
So Gordon covered two pieces of the personnel costs: cash compensation and health insurance. And this is the third major personnel cost. This is what the county pays for its current and future retirees. Every year, the county's actuary calculates the amount that the county should put into its pension plan. It takes into account the number of people that are enrolled, the number of how many years they think they'll be using the plan, mortality assumptions, assumptions about the market, and comes up with a number that is what the county should put in to fund the pension plan. And that's called the actuarially determined contribution, or ADC. The county has not made the ADC or the full ADC payment in at least a decade. So this chart is showing the difference between county contributions into the pension plans and the ADC. And you can see there's quite a difference from 2014 to 2019. In 2020, the county increased taxes and dedicated some of the revenue from that tax increase to putting into the pension plans. So you see that it did increase in 2020, but it didn't quite meet the ADC. Over the past couple of years, that contribution level has remained relatively flat. Meanwhile, the ADC has increased. Part of the reason for this is that when you continuously don't make your full ADC payment, that requirement grows the next year. So it's like if you were to not pay off your credit card, make a minimum payment, the next month, the amount that you would need to pay down your credit card actually grows because you accumulate interest. All things constant, that's essentially what happens here. If you have the same assumptions, if you just don't add the amount that you should each year into your pension plan, next year you have to contribute more in order to fully fund the plan. You can flip to the next slide. So going forward, what would happen if you stayed the course? Pretty much the same thing. The ADC would continue to grow. The county has started in 2024 to increase the amount that it contributed to the pension relative to 2020. It developed a plan to incrementally increase its contributions by $250,000. So that's why you see in 2024, the budgeted amount is $4.1 million. In conversation with the county's actuary, they pointed out that if you were to continue on this course of incremental increases, $250,000 compounded each year, the ADC would continue to rapidly grow. So this chart shows the difference between fully funding your ADC starting in 2025 and staying the course of incremental increases. So the lighter line is the current $250,000 per year increase, and you can see that the ADC grows to nearly $17 million by 2029. If the county were to contribute the full ADC starting in 2025, the actuary estimates that the level of the ADC would pretty much remain relatively constant, growing a little bit over the next 5 years, but it would only reach like $13 million by 2029 as opposed to $17 million. So just referencing back to the baseline projection slide that we shared at the beginning of this presentation, we showed a deficit that grew from $500,000 in the 2024 budget to $27.2 million in 2025. And we've talked about some of the factors that have caused that one-time jump. So we wanted to summarize them here. And primarily, this is driven by the reliance on one-time revenues to close the budget. And as the S&P report noted, this is not something that the county has done one time. This is a pattern over the historical period. So nearly $11 million of this increase is associated with the loss of those one-time revenues, the ARPA revenue, the debt financing, and the reimbursement from the county's health provider. The next driver is the pension contribution that we talked about in the last slide. Our baseline projection, again, this is not necessarily predictive of what the county will do in its budget in the coming weeks. What we assume is that the county will increase its contribution to the ADC level. So that contributes around $8 million to the deficit. The next piece that's contributing to this big jump in the deficit is the loss of real estate taxes that Rose noted in the presentation. So that is through the lower collection rate and from the loss of the Commonwealth Health System assessed value. Beyond that, the county also sees normal natural growth in the cost of its services. So if you do nothing, the county spending on salaries, on health insurance, on its debt, other operating costs just continue to grow, while again, your revenues remain relatively flat or are not necessarily within your control. So referencing back to the baseline projection slide, you do see this big jump up to $27.2 million, but this is a structural deficit and not a one-time event. Your real estate taxes without corrective action are assumed to be flat, while all of these other factors, salaries, health insurance, other things that are tied to inflation continue to grow every year.
All right, so that's enough bad news for one morning. Let's talk about some options for how you deal with it. Right? And again, what we are mostly focused on here are things that the county can do over a 5-year period, because that's what this is. This isn't about getting you through the next 15 months. 2 weeks, you'll be talking about the budget. That will be about the next 12 months, although not exclusively about that period. This is about things that you do over a period of time. I'm going to steal the analogy that this is a little bit like turning a battleship in a bathtub. County governments are large. They're highly decentralized. They have multiple elected officials, most of whom are in this room. You cannot change things like that, right? You have to wait for collective bargaining, and you can't just wipe out entire functions and go, well, I guess we're just not going to have an X anymore. Most of the X's that you have are either practically required or statutorily mandated, right? So you're not going to make the pivot here in an instant. But you have to make the pivot over time, and you have to use the options that are available to you. So these are preliminary recommendations. There are some things on here that are going to make some people uncomfortable, and we need to talk about that because we need to approach this with an element on our perspective of humility. We have ideas, but we don't necessarily have all the answers, but we will share those ideas with you now. And for those who have specific departments, hopefully we've shared them with you specifically as well. So the first thing is a general point. The county needs better position control. What's position control? Position control is knowing these are the positions I have, these are the positions I've funded, these are the positions I can fill. And if it's not on that list, it no longer exists, right? We had conversations with a number of people in departments, and we would hear things when we had a list, what's called a seniority roster, that we would print out and say, hey, these are the 10 positions in your department. And we would hear, well, that one doesn't exist. That one hasn't been filled in 5 years. You're missing these 2 departments. That one's not really a this, it's a that. That can't happen, okay? You have to have a specific list of authorized positions, and the budget sets that list. So if there are 10 positions in a department, they are funded in the budget, they are listed in the budget, everyone can see what they are. And if they are not on that list, they do not exist. That rhymed. It's not a matter of historical precedent. It's not a matter of keeping this as my piggy bank. It's not a matter of this gives me a contingency because I don't want to deal with the salary board. If they're not on the list, they do not exist. The second thing that you use from that is then that's the list you work off of when you fill it. Oh, Felicia, I broke it. No, still okay. When you fill a position, it's not a matter of history or precedent. You look at the budget and say, what's filled, what's vacant, and that's what you work off of. Now, life changes. You will need to add positions during the year. You will not be all-knowing. You will want to make salary adjustments. That's what the salary board is for. But you have to start with a defined set of positions. You cannot have situations, even if it is not department's fault, where departments are spending $1 million more than budget on salaries, because you have no way to make that up. You don't have an earned income tax that can come in at 5% instead of 3%. You've got one tax, and I can tell you what it's going to do. It's exactly the same thing that it did last year, unless you change the tax rate. So you cannot fall behind on position control. Not going to happen in the next 15 days. When the county presents the budget, please don't look for the positions. They won't be in there and go, oh my gosh, they ignored PFM. You have to do this over a period of time. This would be in the 2026 budget. Next one is cash compensation. Now I'll do what Rose did and go backwards in the presentation here. These are the assumed salary increases over a period of time. They're based on the history. You can't afford them, right? You're not going to be able to afford 3 to 3.5% wage increases a year. How do I know? Because that's the revenue that you have to pay for it, right? Unless you commit yourself to doing 4 or 5% real estate tax increases every year, which you could do. It's a policy decision. You're not going to be able to fund these level of salary increases. You're going to have to do something different. That does not mean 5 zeros. You could do a little less in each group. You could go from 3.5 to 3 or 3 to 2.5. You could do one-time freezes. Those are painful, but the benefit of a one-time freeze is I do it today, and the savings associated with that freeze cascades every year because I build off of a lower base forever, right? You could do one-time bonuses. You could do a variety of different things, but you're going to have to do something different on base and wage increases. And again, this is where I get to break all the good news in one morning. It probably starts with the non-represented employees, and it starts next year because this is your chance to pivot that. Not unilaterally, okay? There are certain positions where you need to continue to adjust the increases for salaries either because they are behind or because they have positions like like youth and family service workers where you're trying to fill a vacancy. So this is a little more of a scalpel than a hatchet, but it is something that you're going to have to do broadly enough for it to make a difference. The other thing on this, from a negotiations perspective, negotiations happen behind closed doors. They shouldn't happen through consultants' presentations or through the media. But when when the county and SEIU sit down, the county has to bring to those negotiations the perspective of what can we afford. Now, that may sound obvious to you, and of course you would bring that. But often these negotiations don't really go that way. They focus on work rules or they focus on different things. The county is in a position where it needs to come in and say, for this group of employees, this is what I can afford in cash compensation and in health insurance. And we can negotiate under that. Think of it like a salary cap. We could do more here instead of there. We could do less there and something different. We can add something new if we can find a way to offset the cost. But it is not, we talk about every individual aspect for every employee and everything goes up a little bit, and then we move on to the next one. Because again, the revenue source you have to pay for this doesn't do anything. Right? So you have to look at total cost of compensation. You have to ask yourself the question, can I afford this? And ask it before you get into negotiations, not once the contract splats on the desk up here and someone goes, well, wait, can we afford this? Well, you should ask that 4 months ago or whenever the negotiations started. You have to bring that perspective right away. The last thing is for a certain set of employees, mostly in the public safety realm, there are multiple types of compensation. You get a salary increase, which goes up 2 to 3% a year. In the early part of your career, you get what's called a step increase. You go from correction officer 1 to 2 or 2 to 3, which is generally another 4% a year. You get extra pay for working at night. You get extra pay for working on the weekends. You may get extra pay for being on call. All of these different types of cash compensation, one, they're not unusual. This is not Lackawanna County being extremely unheard of generosity. No, you find most of these things in most union contracts. But what you can't do is increase every single one of them, right? You can't say, well, I'll give you a little more here, and we'll add an extra holiday, and we'll increase your shift differential, and we'll change the step increases, because again, you just don't have the revenues to afford it. This is not a philosophical statement. This is a mathematical truth. On health insurance, the key here is to change the plans and to change the employee contribution structure. So change the plans. That Aetna EPO, if you went back to 1988, those types of plans were the predominant plan in state and local government. They stopped being the predominant plan in state and local government when Bill Clinton was elected, right, in the early 90s. If you look at nationally what employers or what state and local government employers offer, that plan is extremely rare, less than 1%. Very, very hard to afford. The two plans that are most common among state and local governments are the PPO, which you only have 39 people using, and the high deductible health plan, which you don't have at all. You have to make a change. These are trends where the county is frankly decades behind. This is not something that happened last year and you didn't get the news flash. These are things that have been happening over a period of time. You have to offer different types of health insurance plans. Lots of places have them. It doesn't mean you can't get care. It does mean they are less costly. That's a change that the county has to look to make. And the second thing in terms of employee contributions, whether that's the contribution you make up front, what's called a premium contribution, the thing that comes out of your paycheck, or deductibles. Most health plans have deductibles, right? And most deductibles are in the $1,500 for single coverage to, I think the IRS rules are $3,000 or $3,700 for family. You have one plan with a deductible here, and it's a $250 and a $500, right? And it's the one that has it's the plan that has 39 people on it. Having a deductible, I get that it's an uncomfortable change. It's definitely an uncomfortable change if it's coupled in a year where you have less of a wage increase than you wanted to have. But this is the type of adjustment you have to make to get back on trend, to give yourself a chance to stay in balance. Last thing, our name is Public Financial Management, and this is a very heavy dose of financial management. We do have an element of our group that is operational, where we have looked at, okay, enough about dollars, what does county government actually do, and how can you do it better? Obviously against a backdrop of having financial challenges, so the answer isn't hire 100 more people. We will have a set of initiatives that look at how to reduce overtime costs in the prison, where you do have an element of overtime is up, but salary spending is down. So you do have some of that balance there. And we will look, you already heard of some of our thoughts on the sheriff's office. We'll look at it there. Why those two offices? Because that's where the overtime is. You have only 4 departments that really spend a meaningful amount on overtime, and from a dollar perspective, it's really just those two. Adult probation has a little, and youth and family services has a little because of their staffing challenges. So we will look at ways to reduce overtime, which, by the way, at least in the case of the prison, also has an employee benefit. What we have heard is that overtime usage in the prison is so high that corrections officers don't want it anymore. Right? That they're saying, no, I can't work another shift, or you even will see correctional officers call out on sick or go on FMLA, right? So this is as much an element of improving work conditions as it is lowering overtime costs. We believe there are actually some areas where you need to spend more. There aren't a lot. There was one of them specifically called out here in terms of increasing base salaries for assistant district attorneys. Where we've done comparative analysis, we've talked with staff, and we believe that's an area where you actually got to spend more. Not a whole lot right away, not going to be able to do that, not going to be able to do it in a big way in 2026, but this is not take an axe of cost cutting to every single tree you can find, right? There are some areas where you actually have to make an adjustment up. The other things we are looking at from a revenue perspective, this does get back more into the finances. Are there things that should pay for themselves and aren't? You're not going to get a huge amount of revenue out of that, but no stone left unturned. And also looking from an operational perspective at some things where you might like to make an investment, like bringing back a work release program. Good to do, has a financial benefit and an operational benefit of keeping people out of jail, but also has an upfront cost because the county doesn't have a building to put it in right now. And you would have to add 5 or 6, according to the community correction staff, 5 or 6 people to actually do that. So if all of the red numbers that you saw prior to this will tell you that that doesn't mean you can never make that investment. That doesn't mean it's a terrible idea. It might even pencil out in a couple of years, but you have to be very, very thoughtful about how you make those investments. I hope there wasn't a time limit because we went way over it. That is the last slide that we have.
Thank you very much. Do any of the commissioners have any questions or comments? Commissioner Chermak, any questions? Commissioner McGloin?
Yeah, thank you, Gordon, Lauren, and Rose for the presentation. It's been really great. working with you, week in and week out, month in and month out. And, I don't really like to use football terms too often, but there was an old football term that we used to use, and it would say film doesn't lie. Well, in this case and in our findings, and certainly today, numbers don't lie. And the reason for what we're going through right now, and I think we have to remember, is that in Lackawanna County, we measure twice and we cut once. And Dave Bolzoni, as we all know, has done an incredible job for us, but it's always helpful to get a second opinion on things. And again, these are recommendations. We're currently reviewing every aspect of county government at this point to see where we can be more efficient and to really see where we can fix this reoccurring problem of the county just trying to survive year in and year out, rather than doing what we really should be doing, and that's flourishing. The problem was, and it has always been, that Lackawanna County continued to grow and had absolutely no money to pay for it. And again, I just want to remind everyone that obviously this is not the budget. These are simply our findings. But again, if I were to take away one major thing from today, it's that we need to do a much better job with position control, ensuring that we stay on budget and budget for position items that actually are budgeted for. And again, we will fix this. It will take time. But I think all of us coming together and putting a really, really great plan in place, we will absolutely get to where we deserve to be.
Thank you. Gordon, can you just talk about the next steps in terms of PFM's engagement? So I think we are still in phase one, but can you talk about what it looks like moving forward?
Yeah, so three pieces to this. First is the financial analysis. There will be, as if you needed a longer presentation, there will be a longer written version of this. That will be the first. The ultimate thing that comes out of this is a big book, right? It's a multi-year plan. You can touch it. You can use it to stop a bullet. You can prop up your desk with it or whatever you want to do. You could even read it, I guess. The first third of it will be financial, will be this story drawn out in a little more detail. The second part of it would be a little more fleshed out version of the management findings. So we looked at the entire criminal justice system. That was the area that we focused on for this engagement. And all I talked about was sheriff overtime and a couple of other things. We will have more findings on the court administration, not a lot in terms of savings, but we will have more to say because we've spent more time with the folks. There's the court administrator. We've spent more time speaking with the court. We'll have more to say. We've had other conversations with the district attorney and his staff, with the prison. So there will be more in terms of the operational findings there. And we'll have more to say in the employee compensation and financial management realms. That last one I really only touched on a little bit in terms of budgets and position control. And then we'll have the bulk of the plan, the rest of the plan, which are the recommendations. So we wanted to provide recommendations here today so you're not sitting, as you are, and you know this because we've gone through this together, you're not sitting there going, I got an X $1 million hole in my budget. I really wish those consultants would earn their keep and give me some ideas to fill it. These are the best ideas that we have right now. But we need to build them out. We have some others that didn't make the cut for presentation for whatever reason, because the presentation was long enough. We will continue to do that. So that will be the end thing here is a book, but the real end thing is a plan. The plan is not just the pieces of paper that you print off your Xerox machine. The plan is actually the ability to do it.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much for the presentation and all of the work that you've done. I'll be very brief, but just a couple comments. I think today was hopefully a dose of reality for everyone here in the room and then who might be watching on ECTV and the taxpayers throughout the county. Commissioner McGoyan and I have been very upfront and honest since January, since we took office, that we have major financial problems. So I hope that none of this, although there's a lot more details provided today, I hope this doesn't come as a surprise to anyone because we've been saying this kind of ad nauseum over the last few months. Our analysis on things just from like a 30,000-foot view is county government through the years has been, like the train has been on the tracks without conductors. The train has been moving on the tracks, but nobody asked any questions as far as I could see. So is the train moving fast enough? Is there oil in the engine? That's why we asked PFM to come in here and give us an objective view on what actually is happening. It's easy to say, and I've heard this from people throughout the county, well, just cut. cut 5% across the board, cut 7% across the board. Commissioner McGlynn and I are taking an analytical approach to this. We are looking at the data on how we can make meaningful changes. We're not just throwing things up against the wall and hoping that they stick. The other thing that I hope everybody understands is that we are committed to being as transparent as possible about the financial condition of the county, and that is why you're seeing this presentation today. Gordon said it before, a lot of uncomfortable things that were said today, but it's a dose of reality that is honestly needed, because there is no more one-time revenue sources, there's no more can to kick down the road, there's no more road left. Unfortunately, this is what Commissioner McGlynn and I have inherited, but the good news is we're going to fix it. And as Matt said earlier, we really all have to do this together. We owe it to the taxpayers of Lackawanna County. There's 200 and some thousand people that live in this county. The county delivers important services, but we've got to be more efficient, and we've got to do things in a more meaningful manner. So we are committed to fixing this and getting the county to a point where it is in stable financial condition. It's important for people to recognize, and I think Gordon pointed it out earlier, that this is going to take time. He stole the line from me that it's like turning a battleship around in a bathtub, but that is true. There are structural changes that have to be made, but many of them won't happen overnight, but they must happen. We have made some changes already, and I'll just check through some of them. First thing we did was eliminate the health department. If we talk about savings, we took about $4.5 million right off of the books by eliminating the health department and then using some of those resources towards the issues in the Office of Youth and Family Services. We did institute a hiring freeze. We instituted a spending freeze, and we're seeing the effects of that now. We have committed ourselves to the Cash Fest program, which other counties have done throughout Pennsylvania, which we expect to receive revenue from. We have invested in priority-based budgeting, and we've also hired PFM and entered into the Strategic Management Planning Program back in January with the help of the Department of Community and Economic Development. So there's going to be difficult decisions that have to be made over the course of the next few months, but as Commissioner McGlynn pointed out, it's not all doom and gloom. We are working to actively improve the lives of the people in this county, not just simply exist to fund the government. But we must fund the government, and we must make sure that it works efficiently. And as Gordon pointed out, Lackawanna County is a big operation. This is the first step, although uncomfortable, to fix the situation, and that's what we're committed to. So thank you for being here, and we will unveil the budget on October 15th. Thank you very much.